People who are still getting coffee will trickle back in. I want to welcome Mark Finley. He's the General Manager for Global Energy Markets and U.S. Economics from BP. And again, as is customary for me, I don't read people's bios. You could read them yourselves, but I'd like to give the floor to Mark now to actually discuss BP's energy outlook through 2035. Mark?
Ken, thank you for the non-introduction and thank you very much for the opportunity to share BP's outlook with such a great gathering. And by the way, congratulations to you and your study co-authors on another great piece of work. It's I look forward to going through it in much more detail over the next few days, maybe even on the plane ride home. I'm going to share with you BP's long-term world energy outlook today. I think it's important to take natural gas and put it into a broader context. In fact, I've already noticed this morning that my observation seems to be shared, which is that you can't consider the geopolitics of gas in isolation. You have to understand the broader energy context to put that gas into the perspective. And by the way, some of the questions that you're wrestling with around the geopolitics of gas apply to other forms of the energy complex as well. A brief background on the energy outlook before I jump into the presentation. The Energy Outlook builds on BP's annual statistical review of world energy, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that document. BP has published a statistical review of world energy this will be the 63rd annual edition. And the purpose of the statistical review has always been to bring objective energy market data to the public. And we build on that foundation for the energy outlook in two ways. First, we literally build on the historical data set that is built up through the statistical review. So all of the historical data that I will show you today is built around the base of the data in the statistical review. But secondly, and I would argue more importantly, we also try to preserve the spirit of objectivity. What I'm going to share with you is our best effort to articulate what we see as the most likely trajectory for the world's energy system over the next 23 years in this case, with our base data being 2012. And we do that in a way that, well, frankly, there are dimensions of this outlook that my own management will look at and say, really? So, I mean, this is not the world as we wish it would be, but rather, again, our best effort to be as objective as we can be in putting this together, taking into account not only the evolution of the world's economy and demographics, but also technology and, importantly, changes in policy. So that's a differentiating factor, I would argue, for our energy outlook. For example, the Energy Department is required by its charter to take whatever today's energy policies are and to freeze them going forward. And we will see some examples in our presentation of how we anticipate that policy might change in the future. This year we've built our outlook around three themes. We asked ourselves, can the world have energy that is sufficient to fuel continued economic growth, secure, and sustainable? And I'm sure that you recognize already that these themes directly touch on the broader theme of this gathering today. And to preview the answers, which we will weave into the narrative as we go through the presentation, the answers are definitely yes, a mixed story, and at least on the dimensions of CO2, not sustainable for now. But again, we will build those themes as we go through the discussion. Or we won't. Ken? Whoops, now what have I done? I've skipped all the way to the bottom. This is what happens when you let an economist run the AV. I've just run it all backwards, so did you get all that? Here we go. So we will begin by reviewing the high-level trends in the outlook. Then we will go through the data fuel by fuel. And again, I'm going to spend more time on natural gas given the audience and the purpose of this meeting, but I think it is important to cover the rest of the context as well. And then we'll step back at the end and make some observations on CO2 emissions as well. So first off, I'm going to show you the same picture 3 times. Not because I'm a glutton for punishment, but because we're going to slice the data 3 different ways for perspective. So what I'm showing you is our global forecast for energy consumption. By the way, we convert all forms of energy into the equivalent of a ton of oil, roughly 7.3 barrels, so that we can make comparisons between fuels. On the left-hand panel, I'm showing you that we are projecting that energy consumption in total will grow by 39% over the forecast interval. That's about 1.5 5% per year, slightly slower than we've seen historically, due to a combination of consumers reacting to the higher energy prices the world has seen in recent years, but also policies that we will increasingly see impacting the efficiency of energy use, and we'll come back to that concept. As you can see, almost all of the growth in our forecast is in the emerging economies. They account for 95% of all of the growth in our outlook. And you see the various components broken out here. On the right-hand panel, I'm showing you total increments of growth by 10-year periods. And it's important to recognize that we are today in the most dramatic phase of energy demand growth in the world, certainly in volumetric terms at least, and that we expect to see the growth increments slow progressively as we go forward through our forecast interval. Moreover, you can see what is driving that slowdown, principally a slowdown of energy demand growth in China. This is premised on a view that both the growth rate of China's economy will begin to slow, and in fact we're already seeing that, but also that the form of economic development will begin to change in China, away from export-led development of heavy energy-intensive industry and toward more of a focus on domestic consumption of goods and services that are less energy-intensive. And by the way, it's important to note that as we review the historical data, it's becoming increasingly clear that China is the exception. That it's important that we not base our views on how other emerging economies will use energy based on China's experience in the last 20 years. And we can talk more about that later if you're interested. The next slice of the data is to look at energy demand. Remember, same picture, sliced a different way. Here we're looking at it on a sectoral basis. The slowest growing sector for energy demand in our outlook is transportation, and we'll come back and dig more deeply into that shortly. Most of the growth in our outlook is for power generation. In fact, more than half of all of the growth of energy demand is just to generate electricity. And here we show you electricity distributed through two final sectors. And you see that much of the growth is in both industry and in other, which is primarily residential and commercial applications for space conditioning, et cetera. Consistent with our story of a slowdown in heavy industry and development in China, you can see that the slowdown of consumption growth in our forecast on a sectoral basis is primarily in the industrial sector. The final slice of the same data is to show you the data fuel by fuel. In our data, the fastest growing group of fuels by far are renewable forms of energy at the top of the panel on the left. Globally, renewable forms of energy grow a bit less than 6% per year, so 4 times faster than the underlying energy complex. So renewables will gain market share significantly, but all forms of energy grow in our outlook. Among fossil fuels, the fastest growing fuel is natural gas. The slowest growing fuel in our outlook is oil. And again, on the right-hand panel, again, consistent with our story on China, you can see that the slowdown in global energy consumption is primarily driven by a slowdown in coal. And again, we will come back to that as we go through the detail for fuel by fuel. Now, being the pointy-headed nerd that I am, I can't just talk about demand. I have to show you supply. Being an economist, you won't be surprised that in our outlook, supply equals demand. Now, remember earlier I started by posing questions of can the world have energy that is sufficient, secure, and sustainable? Let me begin to address the first of those, the sufficiency argument. We do believe that the world can have energy that is sufficient to meet continued economic growth. Here's the projection by region of the world. Personally, when I put the chart together, I was surprised to observe that Asia is actually the biggest energy-producing region in the world today. For all of the talk about the North American energy renaissance, for all of the geopolitical considerations about dependence on Middle Eastern supply, Asia is actually the biggest energy producer in the world today and remains that way throughout our forecast. And by the way, Asia accounts for half of all of the growth in the world's energy production in our forecast. Today it's a story dominated by coal in China, but as we will see, there are lots of examples of that not being the case necessarily going forward. Now, one of the reasons why we are optimistic that the world can have sufficient energy supply is shown on the right-hand panel. And here what I'm showing you is that we are seeing new forms of energy supply coming already into the mix in a material way. For the purposes of this discussion, we've grouped together new forms of supply from renewable forms of energy and power generation, shale gas and tight oil, the analog for shale for oil, but with a slightly broader definition, as well as Canadian oil sands and biofuels and transportation. These forms of energy alone account for almost half of all of the growth in the world's energy production. And as we will see as we go through in detail, what's driving that growth of new supply? It is technological innovation driven by competition, market forces, and facilitated by constructive government policies. And again, we will see the examples as we go through it. The other reason why we're optimistic that the world can have the energy it needs is that we don't need it to begin with. On the left-hand panel, I'm showing you that we have significant divergence between the growth of the world's economy and the growth of energy demand. On our data, the world's economy roughly doubles over the next forecast interval. Energy consumption, as I mentioned earlier, grows by just less than 40%. And what it means is that if you do the math, the amount of energy needed to produce a given unit of economic activity falls by almost 40% in our outlook. So we're becoming significantly more efficient. Again, what's driving that? Consumers reacting to the higher prices that we've seen in recent years, but also government policies. And again, we'll see examples of that. Keep that visual image in mind, by the way, that big gap growing between energy and economic activity. We'll come back to that concept. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the long-term evolution of fuel shares around the world, including history and our forecast. So today, oil is still the dominant fuel in the world, for now, but oil has already structurally been losing market share for 40 years. And in fact, I'm sure many of you can tell me the exact year when oil's global market share peaked. Now, of course it's 1973. Arab oil embargo, oil prices spiked. Oil has done nothing but lose market share globally ever since. In fact, on our data, both for the United States and for the world as a whole, oil's share of total energy consumption is the lowest it's been in the post-war era. What's been gaining market share? Well, in the last 10 years, it's China, again, the exception rather than the rule. Rapid growth of coal in the last 10 years, but structurally what's been gaining market share is natural gas. And in our outlook, you can also see significant growth of renewable forms of energy, which pass nuclear power and are roughly achieving a market share equal to hydroelectricity in the later years of our outlook. Now, it means that non-fossil forms of energy do gain market share, but as you can see, it's also the case that the world is still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. In fact, fossil fuels go from 85% of the world's energy mix today to about 80% in our outlook. For the purposes of this discussion, another interesting observation is that the world by 2035 will not have a dominant source of energy. This has never happened before. Yes, there have been times when two forms of energy were briefly equal, when coal passed wood, when oil passed coal. But we've never had a situation like we're pointing to in 2035, where three different forms of energy are all vying for the top spot. And I think that might pose some interesting international geopolitical questions. What does the geopolitics of energy mean when there is no dominant energy source? Better minds than mine, I'm sure, will be considering that. I mentioned earlier the importance of power in our outlook. More than half of all of the demand growth is for power. The chart on the left shows you a couple of things. One, that the process of electrifying the world's energy mix is one of the best established trends long-term in the world's energy complex. You see that it does generally nothing but grow for more than 100 years. But also, it's interesting to note that this is not just because poorer countries are plugging in. You can see, in fact, that here in the US and in the other mature market economies of the OECD, the share of energy used to generate electricity also does nothing but go up in our forecast. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you sources of energy or power generation by fuel input. Remember earlier I mentioned that oil has been losing market share? Nowhere more clearly than in power generation. In the early 1970s, a quarter of the world's electricity was generated, nearly a quarter, using oil. Today it's 4%. In the US, it's 1%. So, important concept. Where oil faces competition, oil lost years ago. Who here heats their home with heating oil? I don't see a single hand. Maybe that's just because it's Texas. Who here heats their home? In home heating, oil had a much larger share than it does today. So again, in sectors of the economy where oil has faced competition, oil lost the game a long time ago. What has gained market share? Well, first it was nuclear power, but in more recent years, we've seen the revenge of the fossil fuels. Both coal and natural gas have been gaining market share. Over our forecast interval, coal begins to lose market share, as does nuclear. We'll come back to that. Natural gas gains, but the biggest gain by far is renewables, which globally will account for 10% of power generation by 2035. We can also use our data to make some projections about energy trade. Now, I'll confess, I don't actually forecast every individual trading relationship. I don't have the time for that, and I doubt that you want me to spend time on it. But what we do is look at regional imbalances. And on that basis, I'm showing you the results on the left-hand panel. The way to read this chart is anything below the line is an importing region. Anything above the line is an exporting region. Having the benefit of studying history for 63 years with the statistical review has led us to some interesting conclusions. And those of you who have suffered through our presentations in the past might remember us saying something like this. When a region becomes a net energy importer, it's game over. All you do, based on the historical record, is import more and more and more. Except that's not true anymore. North America, on our data, switches sides. North America becomes a significant net energy exporter over the course of our forecast. Whereas the growth of imports, not surprisingly, virtually all of the net growth of energy imports are going into Asia. Final point on the review of the high-level data before I move into the fuel-by-fuel review is to look at the data for carbon emissions. And not surprisingly, given our outlook, global CO2 emissions continue to grow. Not as rapidly as overall energy consumption, because natural gas and renewables are the fuels that are gaining market share. But they still grow by 29%. Remember, it's not necessarily the world as we wish it would be, but our best effort to describe what looks to be the most likely case based on what we can see today, given the trends and the expectations for markets and political dynamics. And again, we will come back to that question later as well. So let me move into a review of the data fuel by fuel. I know that this is a workshop focused on natural gas, but I'm going to begin with oil and other liquid fuels. It's the dominant fuel in the world still today. The way to read this chart, by the way, I've switched units. We're now using million barrels per day because that's the convention for the oil market. The way to read this chart is we begin with the level of global demand and supply in 2012, and then we show you total increments of change over the forecast interval. Now, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the peak oil argument, and I'm sure many of you know that BP is not a big fan of that notion. We don't believe the world faces a looming resource constraint or a peaking in oil supply. I guess I should have said we don't believe in peak oil supply. Peak oil demand, on the other hand, we believe that oil demand in the U.S. and the other mature market economies of the OECD has already peaked in 2005 and will be in a long-term structural decline going forward, again, based on consumers already reacting to higher prices at the pump and significant increases in fuel efficiency. And all of those declines in all of those rich market economies are offset by growth in one country, and then we add in incremental growth from the other emerging economies. In total, in our forecast, even though oil is the weakest growing fuel, it still grows by 19 million barrels per day by 2035. So roughly speaking, the world needs to add a new Saudi Arabia and a new United States to the world's oil production. So where does that growth come from? I show you the increments on the right-hand side. Most of the growth actually comes from outside of OPEC, a lot of it driven by unconventional supply here in North America, tight oil, Canadian oil sands, etc. By the way, this outlook does take into account declining production in mature provinces like the North Sea. But even with that, the majority of the growth accrues outside of OPEC. Within OPEC, you'll notice that we break out the growth of production by crude oil and liquids associated with natural gas production. The reason why we do that is because OPEC quotas only apply to crude oil. And why that is relevant will come up shortly. First, a bit more detail on the demand outlook. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you again the history and the forecast. Here we're slicing the data by sector and by OECD and emerging economy membership. Within the OECD countries, all of that decline I mentioned earlier is concentrated in transportation. We'll come back to that. Importantly, in the emerging economies, the growth of oil demand is not just driven by transport, but also by industrial sector. Now, on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the growth increments, and hopefully this is a familiar pattern by now that we've gone through this in several slides. But notice the pattern. Remember earlier I told you that the global slowdown of energy consumption is concentrated in industry? That is not the case for oil. In oil, the slowdown is concentrated in transportation. Why? Well, I'll come to the transport dimension of it shortly. But for industry, remember I mentioned earlier that where oil has been facing competition, it's already lost? Turns out that there are segments of the industrial sector where oil does not face competition. Petrochemicals, asphalts for roads. These are technologies that by and large around the world are difficult to substitute away from oil. And so there is a base load of demand growth for the industrial sector that's built into a growing world economy that is difficult to substitute away from. So oil, in that sense, is different than the rest of the energy complex. Next up is the supply picture. I mentioned the importance of growth of non-OPEC supply, and you can see the various components of it on the left-hand side. For the purposes of this discussion, I just want to focus on the right panel, which is the forecast for tight oil production. And the numbers here, I'm sure you all know more about this than I do. But again, for some context. In 2012, the United States had the biggest growth in the world of oil production and the biggest growth in the history of the country. In 2013, the United States had the biggest growth of oil production in the world and the biggest growth in the history of the country. It's for 2 years in a row. We can even go farther than that. We can, using the data in the statistical review, demonstrate that the growth of U.S. oil production last year was one of the biggest increments the world has ever seen. In fact, only one country ever has had a bigger annual increment to oil production than the United States had last year, and that is Saudi Arabia. But most of the times that the Saudis did it, they were tapping spare capacity in the face of a crisis or a disruption somewhere around the world. And in fact, on the most recent data, the U.S. increase last year was the fourth biggest increase the world has ever seen in just organic growth of domestic production. So when you study history, you tend not to be prone to superlatives, because there's always somebody who's bigger and stronger and faster, but this is a big, big deal. And you can see on the right-hand panel that we project that this rapid growth will continue into the medium term and then begin to level off. That's based on our understanding of the resource today here in the United States. Later in the outlook, we see material contributions from other parts of the world, but not game-changing like we've seen here. And I'm sure many of you can, better than I, articulate the reasons for that. Globally, we project that tight oil production will come in just below 8 million barrels a day, about 7% of the world's total production by 2035. And remember that shape, very rapid growth at first and then leveling off. Why is the shape important? Because of what it means for OPEC. Remember I showed you earlier that OPEC quotas impact only crude oil production? Well, the reason why that's important is because when we net out modest growth of oil demand and rapid growth of non-OPEC supply, on our outlook, the world actually requires less oil from OPEC over the next few years, in the medium term. We believe that OPEC members will cut production in an effort to support prices, but as you cut production, spare capacity increases significantly. Later in our forecast interval, remember that growth rate of tight oil begins to slow down, OPEC begins to recover market share, and spare capacity declines accordingly. It's important to note that while we are projecting that OPEC will have to work harder over the next few years, we're not projecting anything like the experience of the 1970s and 1980s, when OPEC lost dramatic market share. Another thing that we have to keep in mind as we study energy markets, the example here is oil, but this example and following discussion also applies to some degree to natural gas, is the outburst of supply disruptions across the Middle East and North America in the rubric of what has come to be known as the Arab Spring. For all of the attention paid to the dramatic growth of U.S. production, what I'm showing you on the left-hand panel is that the growth of U.S. production in the last 3 years has been offset almost exactly, barrel for barrel, by new supply disruptions elsewhere around the world. And moreover, the panel on the right, again part of the benefit of studying history, shows us that when countries suffer disruptions due to civil unrest or civil war, it tends not to come back very quickly. And so I think based on this analysis, I think it lends an air of caution to production prospects in much of this region. again, turning back to the concept of trade, the center panel is the same version of what I showed you earlier for the world's energy system. Here I'm doing it just for oil. So again, the same concept. North America switches from being a net importing region to being a net exporter. Almost all of the growth in international oil imports accrue to Asia. But notice on the top part, the Middle East share isn't growing. So that's interesting. A lot of focus on what are the geopolitics of growing Asian import dependence mean, and focused on relationships with the Middle East. But what our data shows is that the incremental oil trade doesn't come from the Middle East. That Asian importers are going to be increasingly turning to the former Soviet Union, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere for their incremental sources of supply. On the outside panels of this chart, I'm showing you the respective implications of our outlook for import dependence in the United States and in China. And the way to read this chart is the top of the line is the overall demand trajectory for the respective countries, and I'm showing you how that demand gets met. So in the United States, we have, as discussed, declining domestic demand, rising production of tight oil, and the implications are that U.S. import dependence continues to decline. By this point, this is already a well-documented phenomenon. U.S. imports, since they peaked in 2005, have already declined by a volume equivalent to removing the world's third biggest oil consumer from the global marketplace, Japan. On our data, import dependence continues to decline, although the U.S. remains a small net importer even by 2035. On the other hand, contrast the experience and the likely outlook for China. China, if it hasn't done so already, will pass the U.S. this year as the biggest importer of oil in the world. In the late 2020s, it passes the U.S. as the biggest consumer. And you can see that all of that growth is met by imports. We do have only a modest contribution of tight oil to the Chinese energy mix by 2035. And what it means is that in terms of import dependence, both in volume terms and as a percent of consumption, the outlook for China is far scarier than anything the United States has ever lived through. Now, some people have criticized our outlook for saying, oil is the slowest growing fuel. How can you say that? Are you telling me that people aren't going to buy cars around the world? That's not what we're saying. In fact, on the left-hand panel, I'm showing you that we project that the global vehicle fleet will double. In fact, the vehicle fleet in the emerging economies will triple. And yet, if we just look at the right-hand panel, energy demand in the OECD countries declines even as the vehicle fleet rises. In the emerging economies, even though the car fleet triples, energy demand only grows by 80%. So why is it that energy demand isn't growing as fast as the vehicle fleet? The answer, of course, is obvious: improvements in fuel efficiency. So on the left-hand panel, I'm showing you the history and the projections for fuel efficiency, and I'll apologize in advance. Here in the States, our units are miles per gallon, and so to show greater fuel efficiency, the line would go up on the chart. In Europe, the convention is the opposite, but again, the line going down on the chart means that vehicles are becoming much more efficient. And by the way, notice that it's not just Europe and the United States there. Look who else is becoming much more fuel efficient in their vehicle fleet. Now, as you can imagine, this is kind of a core area for BP to be interested in. So every year when we prepare our forecast, we talk to our own technology experts, and then we go to the national laboratories, and we go to the battery makers, and we go to the auto companies, and we talk to anybody who has anything to add into the conversation around the dynamics of the evolution of technology in the automotive sector. And we array all of those technology options, and we look at what delivers the most cost-effective solutions and where the policy requirements are. And every year, what comes back is the way to make fuel efficiency better is to improve the internal combustion engine, supplemented with hybrid technology. And so that's what's in our outlook. By 2035, about 3/4 of the world's new car sales have some form of hybridization in them. Not much electric power. That little wedge at the top that is labeled plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles is actually mostly plug-in hybrids rather than pure electric vehicles. Again, it's a matter of the cost of the battery, the range limitations, the extra weight, etc. Now again, it's important to have some humility when you're putting a forecast together. It could be that policymakers say, I don't care what it costs, you're going to do electric cars. It could be that there's a breakthrough on battery technology. From what we can see today, this looks to us like the most likely outcome. Now what it means is that oil continues to dominate in transport. But does that mean prices don't matter? Of course they matter. Between prices and those big improvements of vehicle efficiency, Transport is the weakest growing sector in our entire outlook. Now, you do see a significant increase in natural gas use in transportation. That's one of the biggest changes in this year's edition of our outlook from last year. But where that gas comes in is in liquefied natural gas, in trucking, rail, shipping, not in your car. And again, for the issues around the range limitations and the refueling infrastructure, et cetera. Now, since we're talking about natural gas here today, why don't we go there? You're probably more interested in this part of it anyway. I mentioned already that natural gas is the fastest growing fossil fuel in our outlook. Here's the data on the left-hand side. Unlike oil, demand grows for natural gas in the U.S. and in the other mature market economies. But it's still the case that the vast majority of the growth is in the emerging economies. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the change on the evolution of natural gas demand by sector of the economy. You can see that it's actually a relatively stable relationship, a bit more going into power, a bit more going into industry, and you begin to see that wedge for transport as well coming in later in the outlook. On the supply side, again, a familiar pattern. I'm showing you where the growth is of production on the left-hand side and the importance of shale gas. Remember I said that oil, tight oil gets to about 7% of the global mix? For natural gas, shale gas gets to about 21% of the mix. So shale is a much bigger deal for natural gas than it is for oil. Similar pattern, for familiar reasons, dominated by the United States, material but not game-changing growth elsewhere around the world later in the forecast interval. And again, a familiar pattern by now, I hope. We're looking at the trade implications of this. And as you can see, most of the growth is in imports is in Asia. The United States and North America as a whole is roughly balanced today, but becomes a significant net exporter. I think that's consistent with your study's findings. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you where the growth is in international trade of natural gas, and you can see that in percentage terms, where the growth is in the trade of liquefied natural gas. And that's kind of one of the purposes of your meeting here today. Here I'm showing you again the familiar pattern of how consumption evolves over time in these various regions and the implications of import dependence. So again, for North America on the left-hand side, the dramatic growth of demand is met by even more dramatic growth of shale production, which also creates room for the region to become a net exporter. By the way, that includes not only U.S. experience, but also exports in Canada. Contrast that with the outlook for Europe and for China. In Europe, consumption grows slowly, but domestic production is declining. And what it means is that for Europe, an increasing share of that demand is met by imported natural gas. China, in our outlook, has the biggest increment for natural gas demand in the world. By 2035, China is consuming as much as all of Europe. And in the case of China, that growth of demand is met through a combination of domestic supply, and here you do see a material contribution from both shale gas and other unconventional supply, primarily coal bed methane, but also significant increases in the import of gas, both through pipelines, primarily from the former Soviet Union, as well as liquefied natural gas. Now, it's fashionable in economic circles these days to talk about real experiments. Has that phrase already come up today? No? Good. Whether you know it or not, you have been participating in a real experiment in the field of economics in the last 10 years. And the real experiment is this. Let's take a region of the world that's disconnected from the rest of the world and drop a big whopping new source of supply on it, and then let's see what happens. Economics 101 would say you'd see a response on the supply side, on the demand side, and on some way to try to connect this isolated region with the rest of the world. So let's look at the objective data. First, on the supply side. Remember earlier we talked about how the U.S. had dramatic growth of domestic oil production? Well, one of the contributing factors is cheap natural gas. You all know this. In fact, when I'm briefing this in Washington, I'd say, imagine you own a rig. In this room, I probably can say, you own a rig. So with your rig, you probably have lived this experience. Would you rather drill for $4 gas or $100 oil? Maybe I'm just the pointy-headed economist. I'd go for the expensive one, personally. And that's exactly what happened. 10 years ago, 3/4 of the rigs in this country were looking for natural gas. Today, the figure is the exact opposite. People are looking more for oil and less for natural gas because people are responding to this cheap new source of natural gas and by not looking for it. We've also seen a reaction on the demand side. So again, remember back a few years. The shale experience really caught the industry and the economy by surprise. All of a sudden, there's a big new source of supply, and it's real cheap. It has to go somewhere. Where can it go? On short notice. It turned out that there was only one place where that gas could go on a real short-term basis, and that was into power generation. Because the industry had built a lot of new power generating plants with natural gas after the deregulation a decade ago, and much of it was sitting idle. So gas, and we heard the reference already, I think Amy mentioned it, that gas had displaced coal in power generation. So that's where the gas went first, into power generation. Now, the rest of the economy required new investment to take a lot of new natural gas. So what we've seen is as gas prices have stayed lower for longer, we've begun to see investors elsewhere in the economy responding to that. First in the industrial sector. Now we're beginning to see growth of industrial sector natural gas demand, but only later in transportation. And the way I think about it is this. If you own a factory and you want to switch to cheap natural gas, you switch out the boilers. If you own a car and you want to switch to cheap natural gas, you have to buy a natural gas car and you have to go find a natural gas refueling station. So there's a lot more moving parts in the transaction. It's not surprising, therefore, that the time reaction is faster in the industrial sector than it is in transport. And so we've seen a very orderly progression of where this gas is going. First into power generation, then into industry, and only later in the game into transportation. And of course, I mentioned earlier, there's the supply reaction. Again, maybe I'm just the pointy-headed nerd, but if I had the choice between selling my natural gas here in the US for $4 or internationally for 12, 15, 20 bucks, I could tell you where I'd want to go. So we've already seen a significant increase in the permitting, the pace of permitting. And here's our projections for the US by itself becoming a significant natural gas exporter, primarily liquefied natural gas, although in the early years, there are also a significant increase in pipeline exports, primarily to Mexico. In fact, our data shows the US becoming the second biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, after only Australia. And again, there's already been some discussion of the geopolitical dimensions of this already today. Today, the world's liquefied natural gas trade is dominated by one large supplier, Qatar, which supplies a third of the global LNG supply. So one thing we can show in our outlook is that the diversity of supply grows in our forecast. You know, the concentration indexes for the economists in the room goes down. But also, the two biggest suppliers are mature market economies in the OECD. And what ramifications might that have for international gas trade and pricing regimes? Let me move on briefly to other forms of energy. We've already talked about the coal story. Here it is. Today, China consumes half of all of the coal on the planet. There's no other fuel, by the way, that has that kind of dominance for one country. You can see in our outlook that Chinese consumption growth slows significantly. In fact, it ceases altogether in the later years of our forecast. And consumption is growing elsewhere, but not at that very dynamic pace that we saw in China. For non-fossil forms of energy, I'm putting them all on one chart. A few observations. First, nuclear power. There's Fukushima. We do have, written down our outlook for nuclear power in Japan and in Western Germany, a few other European countries in response to the tragedy at Fukushima. But we haven't really seen the evidence yet that the nuclear tragedy at Fukushima has impacted plans to build nuclear power in China, Russia, India, and elsewhere. The other big action, of course, is in renewables. And what's interesting to note is that I mentioned already that renewables are by far the fastest growing group of fuels in our outlook. Here I'm showing you a few things. A, that growth of renewables is dominated by power generation rather than biofuels, although we do have some growth in biofuels. But also, renewables aren't just the province of the rich countries that can afford the subsidies anymore. You know, as you can see, significant growth in the emerging economies as well. Partly that's driven by countries getting richer and having more interest in, for example, we heard the question about Chinese air pollution already today. But also we believe that there will be continued supportive policy around the world, both from a climate and a local perspective. And we see costs coming down significantly. Wind is already competitive in many applications around the world. Later in our outlook, we believe that solar, being a less mature technology, has actually even better prospects for significant cost reductions, and therefore the growth rates for solar are more rapid, especially later in our forecast. I mentioned the importance of renewables in power generation. Globally, it's about 10%. And you can see some of the key countries here. China, 10%, the US, almost 20%. Europe, more than 30% of power is going to be generated by renewable forms of energy. And again, on the right-hand side, I'm showing you that it's not just the rich OECD countries that are growing. China actually has the biggest increment of renewable power generation in our forecast. Now, I mentioned earlier that I wanted to end by just stepping back and thinking about CO2 emissions, and so this will wrap us up in the next few slides. Again, globally, we do project that CO2 emissions will continue to grow. As I'm showing you on the left-hand side, all of that growth is in the emerging economies. Not that that's relevant for a global challenge. The red dotted line is the trajectory that the climate scientists say we need to be on if we are to stabilize atmospheric concentrations at 450 parts per million. Manifestly, the world is not on that trajectory. So let's think about this. We can actually break CO2 emissions down into two components. One is, how much energy do you need to run your economy? The other is, how much carbon do you need to run your energy mix? So I'm showing you those two dynamics separated out here. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you the trend over time and in our forecast for energy intensity or energy efficiency. We talked about this earlier. Significant improvements over time, continuing through our forecast. But note something else. The gap between countries is narrowing. What's driving that? Well, the same thing that's driving the increase in efficiency. What's making a prerogative for improving energy efficiency is that energy is expensive relative to economic activity. And what's driving the harmonization of energy use relative to economic activity is the brute force of globalization, driving international trade of goods and services, including energy, forcing countries around the world to kind of consume energy in a similar fashion, to a degree that has never been the case before. And that power continues to focus over the course of our forecast. That is, the homogenization of the way energy is used relative to economic activity continues to converge around the world. Now we'll turn our attention to the right-hand side, which is the carbon content of the world's energy mix. There's a bit of improvement. We talked about it. Natural gas and renewables have already historically been gaining market share at the expense of coal and oil, largely, by the way, historically not because of climate policy, by the way. There's something else going on. Going forward, it continues, but notice that the gap between countries doesn't change. There is no force driving countries to use carbon in the same fashion around the world. There's no international climate policy or carbon pricing regime. So let's bring those themes together. On the left-hand panel, I'm showing you data I've already showed you. You remember the big gap that opens between using energy more efficiently relative to economic activity, and the little gap that opens between using carbon relative to the energy mix. So we can play a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is, let's freeze today's energy mix, and let's freeze today's relationship between energy and the economy, and let's just roll our economic forecast out. If we did that, global CO2 emissions by 2035 would rise by more than 30 billion tons per year. But because we have improvements of energy efficiency and a bit of an improvement in the carbon intensity, CO2 emissions only rise by 10 billion tons per year. And the biggest contributing factor to that is the significant improvement of energy intensity. Now, what it says to us, it suggests, let me put it that way, what it suggests is that when policymakers and the people who elect them around the world decide that it's time to tackle the challenge of climate more aggressively, this might be where the low-hanging fruit is on the carbon content of the world's energy mix, because that's the part we haven't been paying attention to yet. And here's one example, natural gas versus coal in power generation. You can see the data around the world in our forecast and in our, the history and the forecast that, around the world, gas is gaining at the expense of coal in power generation in the US, in Europe, in China, not everywhere though. Remember, without a price on carbon, remember I showed you the chart, there's no real incentive for people to homogenize the way they use carbon relative to their energy mix. The implication of that is, in parts of the world that are hitting that period of rapid economic development where energy demand is going to grow, in the absence of an aggressive climate regime, they're going to use what they have at hand. And so, in places like other emerging economies in Asia, as they are getting on that ramp of rapid energy demand growth, they're going to use what they have. And what they have is coal. So let me wrap up, and thanks for hanging in there, and hopefully I've left at least some time for discussion. We started out with 3 questions. Can the world have energy that's secure, or sufficient, secure, and sustainable? So on the first question, sufficiency, our answer is an enthusiastic yes. We believe that the world can have the energy it needs to fuel economic growth because we see new sources of supply coming in, and we see significant improvements of energy efficiency or intensity. Both of those are driven by market forces, competition, driving innovation, facilitated by constructive government policy, generally speaking. So let's move on to the other dimensions that we posed. Security, great story for the United States, maybe more concern for other key importing regions of the world, including Europe, but especially emerging economies in Asia. Sustainability, manifestly not on that, at least through the lens of CO2 emissions based on this outlook. But I would offer that for the remaining questions, whether it's security or sustainability, there are lessons to be learned by why we're optimistic up here. Why are we optimistic? It's themes that I've already heard repeated here repeatedly. It is the use of market-oriented mechanisms to facilitate competition and innovation in a way that drives lower-cost solutions for society. So let me go ahead and wrap up there. I just close by noting that all of this information is available on our website. You can download the Excel spreadsheets. There's also a special focus on North America on our website and a lot of other supporting material. And if you're so inclined, you can follow us on Twitter. I never would have thought, I have to say, that part of my job would be describing energy in 140 characters or less. But, thank you again.
Thanks, Mark. And I just want to reiterate, for those of you who are not familiar with the statistical review and the outlook, it's actually a great source of data. We use it, actually. So something struck me, and so I'm taking liberties to ask the first question before I come up there and let other people ask questions. But in the LNG outlook that you presented, you had the Qataris actually seeking a reduction in volume. And I was wondering if that was related to consumption in the Middle East and an increase in pipeline flow.
Well, the chart was actually percentage, so we don't have a reduction in Qatari volumes, but we do have kind of the timeout going out. And so what the significant reduction is really the percent of the global trade, and it's them standing still while Australia, the United States, and other exporters continue to grow. How do you recommend I do this? Okay.
Thank you, Mark. That was an excellent presentation and very compelling. You made the observation that historically in every sector where oil has had to compete, it has lost. And you hint that there is starting to become competition within the transportation sector for oil. Is that an accurate observation?
It's not an unfair observation, although I think I would qualify it by, at least based on what we see today, the competition is slow to turn over.
And you think that's the limiting factor is the turnover rate?
Well, and it is important to recognize that while we're not at liberty to share the price forecasts that sit behind our outlook for reasons that I'm sure you can understand, what I can say is we don't build a forecast, and you don't invest based on today's price, but rather on what you expect for the future.
Thank you for your presentation. I did notice a slightly increasing wedge of biofuel, and wondered if you would comment, please, on the economics of biofuel, both with and without subsidies, and also how that might square with BP's having pulled back its investment in North America on non-fuel biofuel investment.
So I think there's a couple things to share on that regard. First, We do believe that biofuels globally will continue to grow. It's a significant increment to our non-OPEC supply outlook that partly is driven by growth of first-generation biofuels in places like Brazil, where it is competitive at these oil prices, generally speaking. And there is some assumption of progress toward next-generation biofuels, facilitated, as we've seen, by policy. For example, here in the U.S., even as the subsidies have been eliminated, we've seen moving to volume, the portfolio standards instead, basically. So, the constructive government policy is still there. But it's also fair to say that the progress of the technology hasn't been as fast as we or others had expected. So you've seen the government, kind of putting off some of those next generation mandates from year to year. And in the appendix of our outlook, you can see that we have actually revised our biofuels forecast down this year and actually last year as well, on the realization that the evolution of the technology isn't proving to be as rapid as we would have once expected.
Thank you, Mark, for that excellent presentation. And let me also take the opportunity to thank BP for its support to the Geopolitics of Energy Project at Harvard and to the study that we're talking about today in particular. I have two questions related to oil in your presentation. The first, and this is a little bit sneaky, but it's a debate that obviously you'll be very familiar with. I'm assuming in the outlook that you maintain the assumption there's no crude exports from the United States. If that were to change, how would you expect the outlook to change? My second question related to oil is I've noticed you have a fairly small increment from Russian production of unconventional oil going out to 2035. And I wondered if you could share with us a sense of your thinking on why the Russians make such a small contribution there.
Okay, let me take the second one first, if you don't mind, Megan. It's important to keep small in context. In the context of U.S. growth, what shows up on that chart as a small increment is still, getting on toward 1 million barrels a day of production. So it's, by any other standard, big. Except when you compare it to what's been happening here. Again, some humility. I mean, this is all new. It's moving very fast. Based on what we understand today about, the geology and all of the above-ground factors, the investment regime, the competitive structure, the opportunity of other investment prospects in Russia, more low-hanging fruit, on conventional opportunities. As we net all of that out, we come to a view that, this is, significant, not small. It is a significant increment of production, but not, to the massive game-changing degree that we've seen here in the United States. And the nice thing about doing an outlook every year is if we learn something new over the next 12 months, well, we'll have a different number next time. And frankly, and that actually gives me an opportunity to look, we force ourselves to come with a point forecast rather than a scenario approach, because at least within our company, we like the discipline of forcing ourselves to take a view. It's not about getting the number right. It's about getting, the trends and the inflection points and the pressure points and, and revealing some of that dimensions of it. On your first question about crude exports, I heard it this morning. The U.S. is already exporting its crude, the changing surplus. It's just being exported in the form of refined products rather than crude. We recognize the political uncertainty and the political sensitivity of the issue, but in the purposes of being forced to take a view for the purpose of putting a forecast together. This is not necessarily the official BP policy. We're studying it. But for the purposes of putting this outlook together, we'd have assumed that economically rational trade to rebalance, the imbalance between crude, light sweet crude and refineries that are configured to process more heavy and sour crudes eventually begins to take place. So how's that for a non-answer answer?
Hi, Dan Cohan. I'm a civil environmental engineering professor here. Two very unrelated questions. One is, it looked like you had projections of U.S. Crude oil production continuing to rise through most of the time horizon. I've seen headlines showing projections that it might plateau much sooner than that, so what the difference was. Totally different question is, when you're projecting out the renewables that are going to be coming online for electricity, how do you handle some of the considerations beyond the levelized cost of electricity that might affect which of those get chosen? For example, wind is often the cheapest on a cost basis, but often sells at a lower price because you can't dispatch it at certain times? It often is it
Right.
worst times of day, the grid issues of integrating in intermittent sources, things like geothermal that could be done as peaking and might have more value to it. Each of these energy sources has its own interesting thing. Solar that could be chosen for residential households where it's competing with retail prices rather than wholesale prices. So how do you
Right.
handle those considerations in figuring out what's going to be dispatched going forward?
So on the first question about U.S. crude oil production, we have it kind of growing rapidly and then trending toward leveling off in the later years of our forecast. That's premised on our understanding of the resource now. There's a wide range of outlooks out there. There are people who think it's going to peak and go into a decline sooner. There are people who think it's going to be way higher. We're kind of in the middle of the range. And again, it's new. We're learning. I would note that, for example, the U.S. Energy Department had tended to be relatively cautious on this forecast, but over the last couple of years, they've significantly increased their forecast. And for example, even just last week said, well, the pace of technological improvement and business practice improvement is kind of more rapid than we had anticipated. So there might be even more upside here. So what we've observed is that, even the people who are more cautious are kind of coming up over time. On your second question, we have the capability in our power modeling to look at real-time pricing and time-of-day issues and the issues that you raise. To the extent the regulatory environment permits that kind of pricing, and we believe that it's actually likely to happen, it would be reflected in our analytics. And so I think, we do try to take into account, the load factors, the time of day, the policy environment, and all of that as we array these technology choices and evaluate their, competitiveness not only for, the upfront investment, but also the dispatch.
Okay, first a comment. About 8 years ago, I think 2005, 2006, I saw a similar energy outlook from BP. And the picture from the United States perspective was very different. It still was a net importer of energy. So we were building terminals to receive a bunch of LNG ships so we can import gas and things on the shore. So now the picture is totally different,
Right.
which is good from a United States perspective. So now my question is, back then we couldn't predict what is happening today. And so what are the risks on some of these analyses that you're looking forward? What is some of the technologies that can be disruptive, either here in the States or elsewhere, that can throw off some of the assumptions that are the baseline for this outlook?
Right. Thank you. One of the reasons why there are other forecasters who go even further out than we do, and one of the reasons that we take a relatively measured approach to the time horizon of our forecast is because we hope and think that it gives us a bit more visibility on the technology set. We try to forecast evolution of technology, but we don't try to forecast revolutionary technology because by its nature it's unpredictable. So what are the key things that could change this outlook? I would say, first and foremost, economic growth. That's the only reason why we consume energy to begin with. So if the world has more rapid or weaker economic growth structurally, durably than we're projecting, that by itself would have a profound implication on this. There's wild cards across the range of issues. There's economic wild cards, there's security and strategic wild cards, there's technology wild cards. So, what happens to, the Middle East, given all the changes that are coming there? Is it actually constructive for investment over time, or is it a concern? Battery technology, is there a breakthrough? Is there a global carbon price? When we started producing this long-term outlook, as an internal company planning document years ago, we had assumed that there would be a global price of carbon by 2030. We don't assume that anymore. We do believe that there will incrementally be carbon policies that we've built into our outlook, including some modest carbon pricing in the U.S. and elsewhere, and also more regulatory interventions than we would have thought years ago, but in a disconnected fashion. A few years ago, we actually included in the outlook a alternative case of what would happen, we thought, if the world became more aggressive in dealing with the challenge of climate. So those are, I think, some of the key uncertainties that we look at. But again, you could make a list as long as your arm, and accordingly, again, more reasons to be humble about our ability to forecast the future.
I have a question. Very often we look at renewables, and they've kind of become the holy grail. It's a catch-all term for the environmentally sensitive people. But what we're finding is, one, the windmills kill birds, raptors particularly, and they are killing the bats because of the pressure. And so at some point, in my mind, the environmental cost of the windmills is going to exceed the acceptability. We're finding that if we use big mirrors, it either kills the birds because they're attracted to it, or we cook them when they're up close to that thing. And so about the only one that works is the photovoltaic cells. And the other is, very often that wedge includes water. And we're in the process of destroying dams because they are affecting the ecology of the rivers. And so the problem, as I see it, is that we still have a large number of people who think that there is a magic solution that will provide energy without CO2 or whatever the nasty is that they're worried about. And that's affecting policy decisions because of the unreality of what they're looking for. To what extent do you all look at that and say, wait a minute, at some point, people will not accept the cost of these so-called environmentally benign energy sources?
Right. As an economist, I'm completely sympathetic to the notion that there is no free lunch. That any of these options have some kind of cost associated with them, and I've already heard, in fact, discussion today about the unintended consequences of various policies, and I think that's actually an important point that we as decision makers, and as policymakers have to keep in mind. Part of the reason why we decided to make this outlook part of the public domain rather than keeping it as an internal planning document was because we believe that we can help contribute to a reasonable discussion about these issues, and help to build understanding in the industry, with the public, with decision makers and policymakers around the world, about the nature of some of these issues and trade-offs. But obviously, these are conversations for policymakers and the people who elect them to sort through. We hope that we can contribute to an informed discussion.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for the invitation.